I want you to picture the exact sound a career makes when it dies. It's not a bang. It's not even a whimper. It's the sound of a conference room door clicking shut behind you, while 11 people who owe you their jobs suddenly find their shoelaces fascinating. That's the sound I heard 19 months ago. And if you stick with me to the end of this, you're going to hear the sound it makes when it comes back from the dead, wearing a very, very expensive suit. But before I get to the part where a man who fires people for sport ends up on his knees on my front porch, hit that subscribe button. Hit it hard. Hit it like you're stapling my old boss's tie to his own forehead. We've got a long drive ahead of us, and I need the fuel. My name doesn't matter yet. You can call me Vivian, because that's what's on the settlement paperwork, and because my mother named me after a soap opera villain, and I have decided, at 51 years old, to finally live up to it. For 22 years, I was the director of risk and compliance for a mid-sized insurance underwriting firm called Halloway Mutual, based in a glass building in a business park in Ohio that smelled permanently of burnt coffee and printer toner and the particular desperation of people who bought khakis at outlet malls. I was good at my job. I was, if I'm being honest with you, and I am always honest with you, terrifyingly good at my job. I was the person who read the fine print so that nobody else had to. I was the person who caught the thing before the thing became a lawsuit, and then a bigger lawsuit, and then a segment on the local news with a chyron that says, "Insurance company accused of." You have to understand what that job actually is, underneath the title. People think compliance is a woman in a cardigan telling everyone to fill out a form correctly. That is what compliance looks like from the outside, the way a duck looks like it's gliding peacefully across a pond. Underneath the water, I was paddling so hard I nearly tore a rotator cuff. I read every policy exclusion. I audited every claims adjuster's file. I sat in rooms with actuaries who spoke in a language of decimal points and mortality tables, and I translated that language into something that would not get us dragged in front of a state insurance commissioner in handcuffs, metaphorically speaking, though there were a few years there where I genuinely was not sure it would stay metaphorical. I built the machine that kept Halloway Mutual out of the newspaper. And then, on a Tuesday in April, the machine's new owner decided the machine was outdated, and he did it while looking at his phone. His name was Dallas Kepler. I want you to sit with that name for a second. Dallas Kepler. It sounds like a name you'd give a golden retriever you were trying to make sound impressive at the dog park. He'd been our chief financial officer for 4 months, brought in after the founder, Old Man Halloway, finally retired to Florida and sold his controlling stake to a private equity firm with a name like a Bond villain's yacht club, Meridian Crest Capital. Meridian Crest did what private equity firms do, which is arrive like a swarm of locusts wearing Patagonia vests, identify the most expensive line item on the budget, and eat it. The most expensive line item, as it turned out, was me and my department. 11 people, 2 decades of institutional memory, gone, on paper, in the time it takes to update a spreadsheet. Dallas was 34 years old. He had gone to a business school you've definitely heard of, gotten an MBA with a concentration in something called value creation strategy, which, as far as I could ever tell, meant cutting things and calling it innovation. And he had exactly 11 months of actual insurance industry experience, all of it at a fintech startup that had since been quietly dissolved after what the press release generously called a restructuring event. He wore sneakers with his suits, not the cool kind, the kind that make you look like you got dressed in the dark during a power outage caused by your own hubris. He called me into the glass conference room on the 14th floor. We called it the fishbowl because it had windows on all 4 sides and no soul on any of them, at 4:15 on a Tuesday afternoon, which is a time chosen very specifically by very cowardly men because it's too late in the day for you to make a scene that anyone important will still be around to see, and too early for you to just go home and cry about it before you've had to sit through the humiliation of packing a box while your coworkers pretend to be very interested in their monitors. I knew before I sat down. You develop a sense for it, the way old farmers can smell rain 3 counties away. There's a particular arrangement of faces that only happens right before a layoff. HR was there, a woman named Priyanka who I actually liked, and who could not meet my eyes, which told me everything. And there was a folder on the table. A physical folder, printed, because apparently even in the year we outsource everything to the cloud, you still need paper to fire someone, the same way you need paper to bury them. "Vivian," Dallas said, not looking up from his phone. "Thanks for hopping in." Hopping in. Like I was a guest on a podcast about his own greatness, rather than a woman with 2 decades of tenure being walked to the electric chair with a lanyard still around her neck. "We've been doing a deep dive on organizational efficiency," he continued, finally looking up, flashing me a smile that had clearly cost his parents a great deal of money in orthodontia. "And we've identified some redundancies in the compliance function that we think can be better served through a specialized third-party partner. We're transitioning risk and regulatory oversight to an outside firm, effective today." I did not blink. I have a trick. I learned it from a claims investigator named Doreen back in the 90s, God rest her cynical soul, where you look at the exact center point between someone's eyebrows. It makes them feel deeply, uncomfortably seen, while you privately think about literally anything else. I was thinking about my roses. "What firm?" I asked. Flat, a dial tone of a voice. "Claris Point Advisory," Priyanka said quietly, sliding a piece of paper toward me, because apparently she'd drawn the short straw of having to actually speak in this meeting. "They specialize in scalable compliance solutions for mid-market." "I know what they specialize in," I said, because I did. Claris Point was a firm you hired when you wanted the appearance of compliance without the inconvenience of an actual compliance department. They were the corporate equivalent of a smoke detector with the batteries removed, technically present, technically mounted on the ceiling, functionally decorative. Dallas slid the second piece of paper across the table. Not a severance package with a friendly little cover letter about this next chapter. A termination letter. Effective immediately. My badge access already revoked, it would turn out, at 4:08, 7 minutes before the meeting even started, which tells you exactly how much they valued my input on the matter. "We'll have security escort you to collect personal items," Dallas said. And then, and this is the part I want you to really sit with, the part that turned a professional disagreement into what I can only describe as a holy crusade. He smiled and said, "No hard feelings, right? It's just business. Sometimes you gotta clean house." Clean house. As if I were a stain. As if 22 years of catching this company's mistakes before they became 6-figure lawsuits was a stain that needed Dallas Kepler's $29 dry cleaning solution. Here is what Dallas did not know, sitting there in his discount hero sneakers, congratulating himself on his synergy. Dallas did not know that 4 months earlier, before he'd even finished unpacking the ergonomic chair he'd expensed for his corner office, the Ohio Department of Insurance had opened a market conduct examination into Halloway Mutual's claims handling practices on a specific line of commercial policies, the kind of examination that, if it goes badly, doesn't just result in a fine. It results in a company losing its license to sell insurance in the state. And layered on top of that, quietly, almost invisibly, was a second letter that had arrived on my desk exactly 19 days before this meeting. One I had not yet had the chance, or, let's be honest, the inclination, to forward up the chain. A formal inquiry from the U.S. Department of Labor into whether Holloway Mutual had misclassified nearly 400 contract claims adjusters to avoid paying benefits, a practice that, if substantiated, came with the kind of penalties that end careers and occasionally end companies. I was the primary point of contact on both. I was the only person at Holloway Mutual who understood the full architecture of what was coming. And in 6 days, on the following Monday, 2 state examiners and 1 federal investigator were scheduled to walk through our doors and start pulling threads. "Is that all?" I asked. Dallas looked, I want to say, disappointed. He wanted tears. He wanted a scene. He wanted a 51-year-old woman to ask him how she was going to pay her mortgage, so he could feel, for one shining moment in his short and floppy sneakered life, like a man of consequence. "That's all," he said, waving a hand. "Leave the badge and the laptop with security." I stood up. My knee popped, a sound like a small caliber gunshot in that glass-walled silence. And I did not mention the state examiners. I did not mention the Department of Labor letter sitting in a drawer. I did not mention that Claris Point Advisory, the specialized third-party partner, was, according to 2 lawsuits I happened to know about because I read industry newsletters for fun the way other people read tabloids, currently being sued by 2 other clients for failing to produce basic audit documentation on time. "Good luck, Dallas," I said. It was not a wish. It was a diagnosis. I walked out of that fishbowl with a calm that I have since learned actively unnerves people. The specific stillness of someone who has already done the math and simply hasn't told you the answer yet. And somewhere behind me, in that glass box, a 34-year-old man in a suit and sneakers was already composing the email that would announce, in cheerful corporate language full of exclamation points, that Holloway Mutual was entering an exciting new chapter of leaner, more agile compliance operations. The countdown had already started, and Dallas Kepler didn't even know there was a clock. You have to understand something about compliance work. And I promise this is the last time I lecture you before things start blowing up, literally, figuratively, and financially. People think regulation is boring. They think it's a woman with reading glasses on a chain telling everyone to initial page 4. What people don't understand is that compliance is the only department in a company whose entire job is to know where the bodies are buried. Because compliance is the department that has to dig the graves quietly enough that nobody hears the shovel. I started at Holloway Mutual in the spring after I turned 29, back when the company was still run by its founder, a leathery, kind, occasionally terrifying man named Walt Holloway, who kept a bottle of wild turkey in his bottom desk drawer and a framed photo of his prize hog, Duchess, on his credenza, and who trusted me with things he wouldn't tell his own board. Walt built that company on handshake deals and stubbornness, and by the time Meridian Crest Capital came sniffing around to buy him out, Holloway Mutual was underwriting commercial policies in 11 states and quietly sitting on a claims history that, if handled wrong, could sink the whole ship. I was there in 2011 when a hailstorm the size of a small war tore through 3 counties in one night, and we got hit with more roofing claims in 6 weeks than we'd processed in the previous 4 years combined. And the claims department, understaffed and drowning, started doing something they thought was clever. They were quietly denying a percentage of legitimate claims on a technicality buried in paragraph 9 of the policy, betting that most homeowners wouldn't have the money or the patience to appeal. I found it. I found it because I actually read paragraph 9, which apparently made me the only person in a 400-person company who had. I walked into Walt's office, closed the door, and told him that if this pattern continued for another quarter, we weren't looking at a bad PR cycle. We were looking at a state insurance commissioner revoking our license and a class action that would make the hailstorm look like a light drizzle. Walt didn't argue with me. He fired the head of claims that same afternoon, personally rewrote every single denied file himself with me sitting next to him with a highlighter, and paid out every legitimate claim with interest before a single lawyer ever got involved. That's not a famous story. Nobody wrote it up in a magazine. I got a handshake and a slightly better parking spot. Then there was 2016, the year Walt's son-in-law, a man named Perry with a spray tan and a timeshare habit, decided he was going to be a hero and quietly reroute a chunk of the company's reinsurance premium into a strategic investment vehicle that turned out to be a friend's failing car wash chain in Sarasota. I found that too, because I am the kind of person who reconciles bank statements for fun on a Saturday night, and because the numbers on a spreadsheet to me are not numbers, they're a confession, if you know how to read them. I brought it to Walt with documentation so thorough it looked like a legal brief. Perry got quietly removed from the board within a month. The money got clawed back before the car wash fully collapsed, and the story that got told to the rest of the company was that Perry had decided to pursue other opportunities. I know the truth because I'm the one who found it, documented it, and buried it in a filing cabinet with a lock I bought myself, because I did not trust the company's own record retention policy, which I had personally written, and which I also did not trust anyone else to follow. You want to know what I got for saving this company from a state license revocation and an embezzlement scandal in the same decade? A 2% raise both times, and, I am not making this up, a laminated certificate that said, Halloway Mutual values you, with a clip art image of a handshake on it. I still have it. It's in a box in my garage next to my son's old soccer trophies, which tells you roughly where it ranks in my personal hierarchy of achievements. I'm telling you all of this not to brag, though a little bit to brag, but because you need to understand what Dallas Kepler actually fired. He didn't fire a redundancy. He didn't fire a legacy cost center. He fired the only human being at Halloway Mutual who knew, in granular, load-bearing detail, exactly how every regulatory near-miss in the company's history had been survived, documented, and hidden well enough to survive an audit. He fired the woman holding the master key to a building he didn't even know had locked doors. For 6 years, ever since a previous close call with a different state examiner had scared the daylights out of everyone, including me, I had maintained something I privately called, in the notes only I could read, the vault. It wasn't glamorous. It was a combination of a secured, encrypted partition on the company server that required a physical security key I kept on my own keychain, a locked, fireproof filing cabinet in my actual home office that held 22 years of paper backups of anything I did not trust to survive a server migration or a disgruntled IT intern, and a private, meticulously indexed timeline of every regulatory inquiry, every near miss, every quietly resolved crisis, cross-referenced by date, dollar amount, and the name of every executive involved. I did not build the vault because I was planning a heist. I built the vault because I had learned, the hard way, over and over again, that companies have short, convenient memories, and that the person who cleans up the mess is always, eventually, the person the company decides to blame for the mess existing in the first place. I had never used the vault against anyone. I want to be very clear about that, because I know how this story sounds so far, and I know you're waiting for me to reveal that I'm some kind of criminal mastermind who'd been plotting a coup for years. I wasn't. I was a tired, competent woman who kept good records because good records are the only thing standing between a person like me and getting thrown under the bus by a man in bad sneakers. The vault was insurance. It was a fire extinguisher I had never needed to pull off the wall. Dallas Kepler, by firing me the way he did, at 4:15 on a Tuesday, with a smirk and the phrase, "clean house," had just set the building on fire himself and then confiscated my badge before I could tell him where the extinguisher was. I drove home with the windows down, which I only do when something in my chest needs the wind to blow through it. I live 20 minutes outside of town in a squat little brick ranch house I paid off 11 years ago, with a half-acre backyard that my ex-husband used to call an aggressive hobby, and that I call landscaping with boundaries. It's mostly rose bushes and one truly enormous, spiteful blackberry bramble that has, over the years, drawn blood from 3 separate door-to-door salesmen and 1 Jehovah's Witness, and I have never once trimmed it back. Because a woman who lives alone needs at least one part of her property that bites. I poured myself 2 fingers of bourbon in a coffee mug that says, "I survived an audit and all I got was this ulcer," which was a gift from my son, and I sat on the back porch and let myself feel it, whatever it was. Not grief exactly. I hadn't loved that job in years, not the way you love a thing, more the way you're loyal to an old dog that bites you occasionally but has also saved your life a couple of times. It was more like vertigo. 22 years, and then a folder on a table and a boy in sneakers telling me to clean myself off the premises. I pulled out my personal phone, the one that isn't tethered to anything Holloway Mutual could reach into, and I did the thing I do when I need to think clearly, which is make a list. Not a to-do list, a ledger. On one side, what they know. On the other, what I know. It did not take long to fill out the second column, and it did not take long to realize how empty the first one was. They knew, presumably, that the State Department of Insurance examination was scheduled because it had come through official channels, addressed to the company, copied to legal. What they almost certainly did not fully appreciate, because I had been very deliberately slow-walking the internal communication about it for reasons I will get to, was the scope of it. A market conduct exam is not a friendly little box check. It is a team of state examiners with subpoena power, sitting inside your building for as long as they need to, pulling claim files at random, cross-referencing your denial rates against your stated underwriting guidelines, and writing a report that can end with anything from a fine to a suspended license to a referral for criminal fraud charges if they find a pattern that looks intentional. What they definitely did not know, because I had received it directly, personally, at my desk 19 days before Dallas fired me and had not yet forwarded it up the chain, a fact I want you to file away for later because it becomes extremely relevant, was the Department of Labor inquiry into worker misclassification. That letter was addressed to me by name, as the compliance officer of record. It was sitting, at that exact moment, in the bottom drawer of a desk that now belonged, technically, to nobody, in an office that a boy in bad sneakers had just decided didn't need a compliance department anymore. I want to be honest with you about something, because I promised at the start of this that I would be. I did not, in that first hour on my porch, have a fully formed plan. I was not sketching out a master scheme on a napkin like a cartoon villain. What I was doing, in that first hour, was something much simpler and, I think, much more human. I was doing the math on obligation. I asked myself a single question over and over, turning it like a stone in my pocket. Do I owe them a warning? And the answer I kept arriving at every single time was no. Not because I'm cruel. I want you to understand that about me because it matters for what comes later. I am not a cruel person. If Dallas Kepler had walked into that fishbowl and said, "Vivian, we're restructuring. I know that's hard to hear. Let's talk about a transition period. Let's talk about what you need to hand off safely," I would have handed him a binder. I would have sat down with Claris Point Advisory myself, on the clock, in good faith, and walked them through 6 years of institutional knowledge, because that is the kind of professional I have always tried to be. I have buried mistakes for men I didn't even like, because it was the responsible thing to do for the people whose jobs depended on the company not collapsing. But that is not what happened. What happened is a 34-year-old man told me to clean house, revoked my badge access 7 minutes before he even told me I was fired, and did all of it while scrolling his phone. He didn't just fire me. He told me, without saying it, that I was disposable. That 22 years of catching the company's mistakes was worth less to him than looking cool in a meeting. And you know what disposable people don't have? Obligations. My phone buzzed around 7 that evening. A text from Priyanka in HR, of all people, the woman who couldn't meet my eyes an hour earlier. "I'm so sorry about today. For what it's worth, I fought this. Take care of yourself, Fee." I believed her. I've always liked Priyanka. She was not the villain of this story. She was just a person standing too close to one when the blast went off. The second text came around 9, and this one was from a woman named Deb Okafor, who ran the claims processing floor 2 levels below where my office used to be. A woman who has worked at Halloway Mutual for 19 years, who has buried 2 husbands and a liver's worth of grudges, and who has never once in her life used the word synergy without following it with a noise best described as a death rattle. Deb and I had lunch together every single day for a decade. Deb is, and I say this with love, the single nosiest, most reliably informed human being I have ever met, and she was about to become, without either of us calling it this out loud, my entire intelligence network. "They already brought in the new people," she texted. "Van full of them showed up this afternoon like it's a hostage rescue. Kid running it looks like he's 12. Asked me where the legacy compliance documentation was kept. I told him it was in the cloud." "It is not in the cloud, Vivian. You know it is not in the cloud." I laughed out loud on my porch, alone in the dark, in a way that startled the neighbor's cat. No, it was not in the cloud. It was on a partitioned, encrypted server drive that required a physical security token, currently dangling off my keychain next to a bottle opener shaped like a fish, sitting on my kitchen counter, 20 feet from where I was drinking bourbon out of a mug about ulcers. And it was in a locked, fireproof filing cabinet in my home office, which was, at that moment, closer to the Ohio Department of Insurance than Halloway Mutual's own headquarters was. Deb sent one more text before I went to bed that night, and it's the one that made me sit up straight on the porch swing. "Also," she wrote, "heads up, the new outsourcing company, Claris Point. Guess who's listed as a strategic advisor on their website? Dallas's brother-in-law." I read it twice. Then I read it a third time. And then, for the first time since walking out of that glass conference room, I smiled. A real smile, the kind with teeth. Because a plan doesn't arrive all at once. Not for me. It arrives in pieces, the way a fraud does, and I had just been handed the first piece without even having to go looking for it. I did not sleep well that night, but for once it wasn't dread keeping me up, it was momentum. I've spent 22 years training myself to notice the loose thread on a sweater before the whole thing unravels, and Deb had just handed me a loose thread with a name on it. Dallas's brother-in-law, a man named Corbin Ash, listed on Claris Point Advisory's public website as Senior Strategic Advisor, Risk and Regulatory Practice, complete with a headshot taken at what I can only assume was a mall photo studio, and a bio full of words like thought leadership and cross-functional synergy, which, by the way, is a phrase I am now legally required to hate for the rest of my life. I spent Wednesday morning doing what I do best, which is not accusing anyone of anything, but simply, patiently, quietly, pulling a thread. I am, I should mention, extremely good at public records searches, because compliance work teaches you that everything that matters is written down somewhere, usually by someone who didn't think anyone would ever bother to look. Ohio's Secretary of State business filings are public. Corbin Ash wasn't just an advisor at Claris Point. Corbin Ash was, according to the filing from 14 months earlier, a 22% equity holder in Claris Point Advisory, LLC, registered under a holding company called Ash Family Holdings, whose registered agent, I discovered after about 40 more minutes of digging that I will not bore you with the mechanics of, shared a business address with a trust that, according to a probate filing from 3 years prior involving Dallas's late father-in-law, listed Dallas Kepler's wife, Marisol, as a beneficiary. Let me translate that out of compliance speak and into human language, because this is the part where the story stops being about hurt feelings and starts being about federal crime. Dallas Kepler, the chief financial officer of Holloway Mutual, had just fired an entire in-house compliance department at the exact moment 2 separate government investigations were converging on the company, and outsourced the entire regulatory function to a firm in which his own wife's family held a direct financial stake, run in part by his own brother-in-law. That is not a cost-saving restructuring. That is a man funneling company money into his own household while simultaneously making sure the 2 people best positioned to notice, me, and by extension anyone with real regulatory experience, were no longer in the building to catch it. I sat with that for a long time on Wednesday afternoon, watering my roses with a garden hose in one hand and my phone in the other, scrolling through incorporation documents like other people scroll through vacation photos. Because here's the thing about a discovery like that. It doesn't feel like triumph, not right away. It feels like nausea. Because I understood immediately exactly what was coming. If Claris Point Advisory, an underqualified, related party firm with a financial conflict of interest so obvious a first-year paralegal could spot it, was about to become the company's primary point of contact for 2 active federal and state investigations, then Holloway Mutual wasn't just underprepared for the audit that was 6 days away. Holloway Mutual was about to hand a loaded gun to the person who'd put the bullets in it. Thursday brought the first crack in the dam. Deb called me around lunchtime, not texted, called, which for Deb is the equivalent of a 5-alarm fire, because Deb considers phone calls a violation of her constitutional rights. "They can't get into the Z drive," she said without so much as a hello. "The kid, Bryson, his name is actually Bryson, Vivian. I want you to sit with that. Bryson has been standing outside your old office for 2 days asking IT for administrative override, like that's a thing you can just ask for. Marcus and IT told him he'd submitted a ticket. There is no ticket. Marcus told me there is no ticket. Marcus hates them because they cut his overtime budget to pay for the new cold brew machine on the executive floor, and Marcus, God bless him, is a petty, petty man, and I love him for it. I laughed so hard I had to sit down on my porch step. They also, Deb continued, and I could hear the specific glee in her voice that only comes from 19 years of watching incompetence up close, sent an email to the whole claims floor asking, and I am reading this to you verbatim, whether historical audit remediation files were stored in a shared network location, physical archive, or personal employee custody. Bryson doesn't know where anything is, Vivian. Bryson thinks a filing cabinet is a metaphor. Did anyone answer him? I told him I'd get back to him, Deb said. I will not be getting back to him. Thursday evening, my personal phone lit up with a text from a number I didn't recognize. Hi, Vivian. This is Bryson Cole from Claris Point Advisory. So excited to be picking up where you left off. Quick question when you have a sec. Where are the historical audit remediation binders kept? Trying to get organized before next week's exam. Thanks so much. I stared at that text for a long moment, at the 2 exclamation points doing the heavy lifting of a man who had absolutely no idea what was about to happen to him. And I did the only reasonable thing a woman in my position could do. I blocked the number, refilled my mug, and went outside to prune my roses, because there is nothing on this earth more satisfying than cutting away dead wood with a clear conscience. Friday, the texts escalated, because panic always escalates on a schedule, the way water always finds the crack in a foundation. Dallas himself texted me directly for the first time, from his personal number this time, not his work line, which told me the fear had finally crawled far enough up his spine to make him nervous about a paper trail. Hey, Vivian. Hope no hard feelings about the transition. Wanted to see if you'd be open to a paid consulting arrangement to help Claris Point get up to speed on some of the historical files before Monday. Would really appreciate it. I read it 3 times. I want you to notice something with me, because it's important. 4 days earlier, this man had told me to leave my badge with security and had used the phrase, clean house. Now, with a federal inquiry and a state examination bearing down on a company he had just gutted, he was asking me, politely, with a hope no hard feelings, to come clean up the mess he'd made, for money, on short notice, like I was a plumber he'd insulted and was now hoping hadn't left town. I did not respond Friday night. I let it sit. I have found, over 22 years of dealing with men exactly like Dallas Kepler, that silence is the single most expensive thing you can give them, because it costs you nothing, and it costs them their weekend. Saturday morning, I was up at 6, out in the garden before the heat set in, pruning shears in hand, working through the roses row by row. And I want to tell you that I felt something close to peace, if peace is a word that can coexist with the specific, quiet satisfaction of watching a countdown you set in motion continue ticking without you having to lift another finger. My neighbor, Marla, who is 81 years old, wears a different colored tracksuit for every day of the week and has never once in the 11 years I've known her asked a follow-up question she didn't already know the answer to. Leaned over the fence around 7:30. "You're up early for a woman who got fired," Marla said, lighting a cigarette that was, I swear to you, longer than her forearm. "Got a lot of pruning to catch up on," I said. Marla said, exhaling a plume of smoke toward my rose bushes like she was blessing them. "You look happier than you have in 10 years, Vivian. What'd you do?" "Nothing yet," I said, and I meant it, technically, in the narrowest possible sense, because I hadn't done anything. I hadn't sabotaged a single file. I hadn't deleted a single email. I hadn't leaked a single document. All I had done, in the 4 days since Dallas Kepler told me to clean house, was decline to volunteer information nobody had the decency to ask for correctly, and keep paying very, very close attention. By Sunday night, the text from Bryson had stopped, replaced by a single, longer message from Dallas that had lost every trace of its earlier breeziness. It read simply, "Vivian, we really need to talk before tomorrow. This is important. Please call me." I read it on my back porch, in the last purple light of the evening, with a glass of iced tea I had, admittedly, spiked rather generously with bourbon. And I typed out a response, then deleted it, then typed out another one, then deleted that too, and finally settled on the only response that felt true. "I don't work there anymore, Dallas. You made that very clear." I hit send, set the phone face down on the porch railing, and watched the sun finish going down, thinking about a room full of state examiners with subpoena power who were going to walk through Holloway Mutual's front doors in exactly 14 hours, expecting to meet a compliance team that, as of that moment, consisted of one 26-year-old named Bryson who thought a filing cabinet was a metaphor. Monday morning, I did not go to Holloway Mutual. Why would I? I did not work there. I made myself a pot of coffee, put on real clothes for the first time in 5 days, which felt strange, like putting on a costume of a person I used to be, and I drove to the farmer's market. Because it was Monday, and the Monday market has the good peaches, and because there is something deeply, spiritually satisfying about buying produce at 9 in the morning while, 20 minutes away, a building full of people who fired you is quietly catching on fire. I found out what happened, as I found out about most things that week, from Deb, in a series of texts that arrived roughly every 40 minutes like dispatches from a war correspondent. 9:15. They're here. 2 women in gray suits and a guy who looks like he irons his own socks. They asked for the compliance liaison, and Bryson literally raised his hand like we were in 3rd grade. 9:50. Bryson just told the lead examiner, and I quote, "We're still onboarding our historical data architecture." She wrote something down. Vivian, she wrote something down. 10:30. Dallas came down from the executive floor. He is sweating through a dress shirt that I happen to know retails for around $240 because he told the whole floor about it in March. He asked the examiners if they'd like coffee. The lead one, her name is apparently Ms. Okonkwo Barrett, said, and again I am quoting directly, "We'd like the claims denial log for the past 36 months, cross-referenced against underwriting exceptions by end of day." 11:15. Bryson does not know what an underwriting exception is. I watched him Google it, on his phone, in front of the examiner. She saw him do it. By 11:30, Deb sent a photo, blurry, taken from her cubicle at an angle clearly designed to avoid detection, of Dallas standing in the middle of the claims floor with his sleeves rolled up, looking, in Deb's words, like a man who just realized the parachute he packed was actually a backpack full of rocks. I want to be fair to Dallas for one paragraph, because fairness matters to me, even when I'm enjoying myself this much. It is not that Dallas was stupid, exactly. It's that Dallas had spent his entire short career in rooms where the consequences of a decision showed up 18 months later, in a spreadsheet, as a number that somebody else would eventually have to explain to somebody else. He had never sat across a table from a state examiner whose entire job was to find the gap between what a company says it does and what a company actually does, and then write that gap down, permanently, in a report that follows the company forever. He had never had to answer, in real time, with a human being watching his face, a question he did not know the answer to. Dallas Kepler, for the first time in his career, was finding out what it feels like to be the person in the room without the paper trail. And I will confess to you, sitting at that farmer's market with a bag of Monday peaches, that I felt something close to religious satisfaction. Around 1 in the afternoon, my personal phone rang. Not a text, an actual phone call from a number I recognized as Holloway Mutual's main corporate line, which meant somebody had gotten desperate enough to call the front desk and ask them to patch through to a fired employee, which is not a thing the front desk is supposed to do, and which told me exactly how far the wheels had come off. I let it ring. I bought a peach. I did not answer it. It rang again 40 minutes later. I let that one go too, sitting in my car in the farmer's market parking lot, watching a toddler 2 spaces over have the kind of meltdown over a dropped ice cream cone that felt, honestly, like a fairly reasonable emotional response to the universe, and one I sympathized with more than I would have a week earlier. The third call came at 2:40, and this time it wasn't the corporate line. It was a mobile number I didn't recognize, and something made me answer it. Call it curiosity. Call it the specific gravitational pull of watching a house of cards you built yourself finally start to sway. "Is this Vivian?" a man's voice said, clipped, tired, older than Dallas, the voice of a man used to other people jumping when he spoke. "This is Reginald Voss. I'm the managing partner at Meridian Crest Capital." I want you to understand something about that name, because it matters. Meridian Crest Capital was the private equity firm that had bought controlling interest in Holloway Mutual from Old Man Walt 8 months earlier. Reginald Voss was not a man who called fired employees. Reginald Voss was a man whose entire professional existence was built around never having to personally clean up a mess, because that's what he paid people like Dallas Kepler to do. If Reginald Voss was calling me directly, on a Monday afternoon, using his own cell phone rather than having an assistant do it, then whatever was happening inside Holloway Mutual's headquarters had climbed several floors higher than I had originally estimated. "Mr. Voss," I said, pleasant as a Sunday sermon, "what can I do for you?" "We understand there may have been some miscommunication around your departure," he said, in the careful, lawyered voice of a man who had clearly had this sentence workshopped by someone before dialing. "We'd like to discuss bringing you back in a consulting capacity, effective immediately, to assist with an active regulatory matter." "An active regulatory matter," I repeated, tasting the phrase like it was something slightly spoiled. "There's a state examination underway," he said, "and it appears the transition to the new compliance vendor has hit some friction. We think your institutional knowledge would be extremely valuable in the short term." Friction. I nearly laughed into the phone. Somewhere in that building, a 26-year-old named Bryson was Googling the word exception in front of a state examiner named Ms. Okonkwo Barrett, and Reginald Voss, managing partner of a private equity firm with, I would later learn, over $400 million in assets under management across its portfolio companies, was calling it friction. "I appreciate the call," I said. And I meant it, in the sense that I appreciated exactly how much information it had just handed me for free. "But I don't work for Holloway Mutual anymore, Mr. Voss. Dallas made that very clear last Tuesday. Something about cleaning house." There was a pause on the line, the specific silence of a very rich man realizing, in real time, that he was going to have to say a sentence he did not enjoy saying. "We'd be prepared to discuss appropriate compensation," he said. "I'm sure you would," I said. "Have a good afternoon, Mr. Voss." I hung up. I sat in my car in the farmer's market parking lot for a long moment, holding a bag of peaches, watching the toddler finally calm down 2 spaces over, as her mother produced a second, backup ice cream cone from what I can only assume was a diaper bag stocked for exactly this contingency. And I thought, not for the first time that week, that there was a lesson in that for all of us. And the lesson was this: always keep a backup plan, and never, ever tell the person holding it that you think they're disposable. My phone buzzed one more time before I started the car. A text, this time from Deb, sent at 2:58, 4 minutes after I'd hung up with Reginald Voss. Examiners just asked to speak to the person who prepared the historical remediation files referenced in the file index. Bryson said that person no longer works here. The lead examiner asked who authorized her departure, given the active nature of a pending inquiry. Vivian, I think you need to sit down for the next part. I was already sitting down. I was sitting in a Honda Civic in a farmer's market parking lot with a bag of peaches on the passenger seat, and I typed back a single word. Go on. The examiner, Deb wrote, asked for that person's contact information in writing for the file. Dallas is white as a sheet. He just walked into his office and closed the door. I can hear him through the wall. He's on the phone with someone, and I think he's crying a little bit, Vivian. Actually crying. I put the car in reverse, backed carefully out of my parking spot, and drove home with the windows down and absolutely no intention of answering my phone again that day, feeling, for the first time in a very long time, like a woman with all the time in the world. Here is where the story stops being a simple tale about a bad boss and starts being the kind of thing that, 18 months later, gets referenced in a footnote of a federal indictment. And I promise I'm not exaggerating for dramatic effect, because I have read the footnote. I have it printed out. It's in the vault, right next to Perry the son-in-law's car wash paperwork, because I told you, I keep everything. Tuesday morning, Deb called me before 8, which for Deb is the middle of the night. They pulled Dallas's calendar, she whispered, and I could hear her walking somewhere quiet, probably the stairwell she uses when she wants to talk without the whole floor hearing her, which is most of the time, because Deb has the vocal projection of a woman raised in a house with 6 siblings and 1 bathroom. The examiner subpoenaed his calendar and his corporate email as part of the document production request. Marcus had to pull it. He told me, Vivian, he told me there's a recurring meeting on there, monthly, going back to before Dallas even started, labeled MC Strategic Sync. Guess who's on the invite? Reginald Voss, I said. Reginald Voss, Deb confirmed. And Corbin Ash. Every month. Before Claris Point even existed as a company on paper. I sat with my coffee going cold in my hand, and I felt the shape of the whole thing rearrange itself in my mind, the way a puzzle you've been staring at sideways suddenly resolves into a picture. I had assumed all week that this was a story about one arrogant, underqualified young executive making a catastrophically self-serving decision to enrich his own family at his employer's expense, while blind to the regulatory storm bearing down on him. That story was true, but it was only the smaller story sitting inside a much bigger one. Meridian Crest Capital, I would learn over the following weeks through a combination of Deb's intelligence network, my own increasingly obsessive public records habit, and eventually sworn testimony that became a matter of public record, had a pattern. They bought mid-sized, well-run, boring companies like Halloway Mutual, companies with decades of clean operating history and loyal, competent staff who kept things quiet and functional. And then they installed a young, malleable, ambitious executive, someone with an MBA and no actual industry experience, someone who would owe his career entirely to Meridian Crest and would therefore do whatever he was told. and had that executive systematically hollow out the exact departments most likely to notice financial irregularities: internal audit, compliance, risk management. Once those departments were gutted and replaced with cheap, related party vendors controlled by people loyal to the acquiring firm, Meridian Crest would begin extracting value from the company through management fees, strategic consulting arrangements, and related party contracts that a functioning compliance department would have flagged in a heartbeat, right up until the company's financials looked good enough on paper to sell to the next buyer. At which point Meridian Crest would exit, pocket the difference, and move on to the next acquisition, leaving the new owners to eventually discover the rot. Dallas Kepler was not the villain of this story. Dallas Kepler was the disposable middle manager Meridian Crest had installed to execute a script that Reginald Voss had, according to court documents that would surface much later, run at 2 prior portfolio companies. Dallas fired me not entirely because he thought I was outdated, though he genuinely did think that, God help him, but because gutting compliance was step 1 of a playbook he'd been handed, and outsourcing it to his own brother-in-law's firm was less a betrayal of the company and more Dallas trying to get his own small cut of a much larger extraction scheme that Reginald Voss had been running quietly for years. I did not know all of this on Tuesday morning. I knew enough of it to feel a very specific, very cold clarity settle over me. The kind of clarity I imagine a surgeon feels the moment they realize the thing they thought was a routine appendectomy is actually something much bigger, spreading in directions the initial scan didn't show. The State Department of Insurance examination, I understood now, was the smallest fire in the building. What was actually smoldering underneath it was something closer to a private equity firm systematically defrauding a series of companies and, by extension, the investors and pension funds that had put money into Meridian Crest's funds, trusting they were buying into a boring, stable insurance holding company. And I, sitting in my kitchen in a bathrobe with cold coffee, holding 22 years of meticulously organized paper trail, 26 months of it covering exactly the period Dallas Kepler had been on the MC Strategic Sync calendar invite, was suddenly holding something worth a great deal more than a severance negotiation. I did not go looking for the FBI. I want to be very clear about that, because I've thought about it a lot since, and I think it matters. I have never, in my life, called a federal agency to report anything. And it had not occurred to me, in the 6 days since Dallas told me to clean house, that this was a road I would end up walking down. What happened instead is that the Ohio Department of Insurance examiner, Ms. Okonkwo Barrett, a woman I would come to genuinely respect, found something in the fragmented, chaotic documentation Bryson and his colleagues had managed to scrape together that concerned her enough. Specifically, a pattern of related party payments routed through Claris Point back to an entity connected to a MC Strategic Sync she'd found referenced in an email chain, that she made a referral, as state examiners are required to do when they see something that smells less like a regulatory violation and more like a federal one, to the FBI's White-Collar Crime Division. I found out about the referral on Wednesday, not from Deb, but from a phone call I nearly didn't answer, from a number that came up simply as Federal Bureau of Investigation, which is a phrase that will make even the most innocent person's stomach drop through the floor. Ms. Vivian March, a calm, measured voice said, and I want you to notice that this man used my actual name, which by that point in the week felt almost quaint. My name is Special Agent Desmond Whitfield. I'm with the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit out of the Cincinnati Field Office. I understand you may have some historical documentation relevant to a matter we're looking into involving Halloway Mutual and Meridian Crest Capital. I sat down very slowly at my kitchen table. I might, I said. We'd like to talk. Agent Whitfield said, in the tone of a man who had clearly had a very long, very informative conversation with Ms. Okonkwo Barrett already. At your convenience, of course. But I'll be honest with you, Miss March. Based on what the state examiner flagged for us, and based on some banking records we've already been able to pull independently, we think you may be sitting on the single most complete evidentiary record that exists of what's been happening inside that building for the past 8 months. I looked out my kitchen window at my roses, and at the ridiculous, spiteful blackberry bramble that had never once let a stranger through unbloodied. And I thought about a folder on a table in a glass conference room, and a boy in bad sneakers telling me to clean house. And I said the only thing that felt true. I think you're right, Agent Whitfield, I said. Why don't you come by the house on Friday? I'll put on a pot of coffee. They showed up at my house on Thursday afternoon, 4 days before I even had my scheduled coffee with Agent Whitfield. And I want to describe the scene to you exactly as it happened, because I have replayed it in my head more times than is probably healthy, and every time I do, I enjoy it slightly more, the way a good bottle of wine gets better with a little air. I was on the back porch in my robe at 2 in the afternoon on a Thursday, which is a level of leisure I had not experienced since roughly the Clinton administration, when I heard 2 car doors close out front, one right after the other, with the specific hurried cadence of men who had argued about who would ring the doorbell the entire drive over. I did not get up right away. I let them knock twice. When I opened the door, Dallas Kepler was standing on my porch in a suit that had clearly not been slept in, though his face suggested he hadn't slept in it either, next to a man I recognized immediately, despite never having met him in person, from the small, professionally lit headshot on Meridian Crest Capital's website. Reginald Voss, 60-something, silver-haired, the kind of tan that costs money rather than sunlight, wearing the specific expression of a man who has spent 30 years being the most powerful person in every room he's ever entered, and was now standing on a porch in the suburbs being made to wait. "Vivian," Dallas said, and I noted, with some satisfaction, that the smirk from the fishbowl conference room was gone, replaced by something closer to the expression of a man watching his own house burn down from across the street. "Thank you for seeing us." "I didn't agree to see you," I said. "You're standing on my porch." Mrs. Higgins next door, that's Marla, if you'll recall, though she has requested I refer to her by a more dramatic name for the purposes of this retelling, and frankly she's earned it, had already put down her gardening trowel and was watching the whole thing over the fence with the rapt attention of a woman who pays for cable specifically for moments like this. "We'd like a few minutes of your time," Reginald Voss said, in a voice that had clearly closed 9-figure deals and had never once, in his memory, been made to stand on a residential porch waiting for permission to speak. "We're prepared to discuss a very generous arrangement." "Are you?" I said. "Vivian, please," Dallas said, and here it comes, the part I want you to really savor. "We're in a real bind. The examiners are asking for documentation we can't produce. There's talk of a referral. Vivian, I have a mortgage." I let that sentence sit in the air for a full 3 seconds, because I wanted him to hear it the way I was hearing it. A man who had told me 7 days earlier to leave my badge and my laptop and clean myself off the premises was standing on my porch in a suit he hadn't slept in, telling a 51-year-old woman he'd just fired that he had a mortgage. "I have a mortgage too, Dallas," I said. "It's paid off. Because I've worked very hard for a very long time, and I've never once told anybody to clean house on their way out the door." "We understand there was a communication failure," Reginald Voss said, stepping in smoothly, the way I imagine he'd stepped into 100 rooms exactly like this one, redirecting a conversation that was going badly for the person he'd brought with him. "We'd like to bring you back in a senior advisory capacity. Immediately. Retroactive compensation, a signing bonus, whatever's required to make this right." "To make what right?" I said. "The part where you gutted the compliance function of a company facing 2 active investigations to install your brother-in-law's shell firm, Dallas? Or the part where you," I turned to Voss, "have been running the exact same playbook at portfolio companies for years, using disposable executives to hollow out the departments that would otherwise catch you doing it?" I want you to understand, the porch went very, very quiet. A bird somewhere in my blackberry bramble stopped singing, which I choose to believe was out of professional courtesy. Dallas's face went the specific shade of gray that a man's face goes when he realizes the woman in front of him knows significantly more than he was hoping she did. Reginald Voss, to his credit, did not flinch outwardly, but something behind his eyes recalculated, fast, the way a chess player's does when they realize the board isn't the one they thought they were playing on. "I don't know what you think you know," Voss said carefully, "but I'd caution you against making accusations you can't substantiate." "Oh, I can substantiate it," I said, and I let myself smile, just a little. The smile of a woman who spends her weekends reconciling bank statements for fun. "I have 26 months of email metadata, meeting invites, related party payment records, and a filing cabinet full of paper that predates every server migration this company has ever done. I've had it for years, gentlemen, because that's my job. Or it was, until somebody decided the old way of doing things was too heavy." Dallas actually made a small strangled noise, the noise of a man watching his own words come back around to strangle him. "We can discuss compensation," Voss said again, and I noticed he had started saying "we" less and "I" more. The linguistic shift of a man beginning to distance himself from the person standing next to him. "You misunderstand the situation," I said. "This isn't a negotiation about my old job. I don't want my old job. I wouldn't take my old job if you paid me in gold bars and personally apologized on television. What we're going to discuss, gentlemen, is what happens on Friday, when a federal agent comes to this house for coffee." Dallas actually swayed on his feet. I am not exaggerating. A grown man, 34 years old, standing on my porch, swayed like a tree in a stiff wind. "Federal," he said, in the voice of a man who had just watched his entire life rearrange itself in real time. "You're bluffing," Voss said. But he said it the way people say things when they very much hope they're true and have a growing suspicion they are not. I did not answer that directly. Instead, I reached into the pocket of my robe because I had, in fact, dressed for this exact conversation the moment I heard the second car door close. Robe or no robe, a woman prepares. And pulled out my phone, and I showed them, not the content, just the screen, of a text thread with a contact saved simply as S.A. Whitfield, FBI. I did not let them read it. I let them see that it existed, the way you show a burglar a home security sign without needing to explain the wiring behind it. "Here's what's going to happen," I said, "and I want you to know that my voice did not shake, not once, through any of this, because I had spent 22 years learning exactly how to sound calm while delivering the worst news of somebody's professional life. Friday morning, I am having coffee with a special agent from the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit, and I am handing him 22 years of documentation, because that is the right thing to do, and because, frankly, at this point, gentlemen, it would be illegal for me not to. What you get to decide, right now, on my porch, is whether I also, separately, on a consulting basis, help this company's board and its remaining honest employees survive what's coming, or whether I let the two of you figure it out yourselves with a filing cabinet you can't open and a compliance director who thinks a filing cabinet is a metaphor. You're blackmailing us, Voss said, and there was real anger in it now. The anger of a powerful man discovering, for possibly the first time in his adult life, that he was not the most powerful person in the room. No, I said. I'm a consultant. Very different tax bracket. There was a long silence on the porch. The kind that has weight to it. The kind you could set a coffee cup down on. Marla, next door, had abandoned all pretense of gardening and was simply standing at the fence with her arms crossed, watching the proceedings like a woman at a tennis match who had money on the outcome. "What's your rate?" Voss finally said, and I want you to notice that he did not ask if I had one. Men like Reginald Voss always assume, correctly in this case, that everyone has a rate, and the only real question is the number. "For forensic compliance reconstruction and crisis advisory services," I said, channeling every mechanic I have ever met who charges $400 to tell you which wire is loose. "My standard rate is $12,000 a day, with a 5-day minimum, payable up front before I open a single filing cabinet." Dallas made another noise, a sort of wounded animal sound, and I let myself enjoy it for exactly as long as it took him to compose himself enough to speak. "That's $60,000, he said, in the tone of a man doing math he did not want to be doing. "It's not for the 5 days, I said. And here is the part I had been saving, the part that had been building in me since a Tuesday afternoon and a folder on a table. It's for the 22 years. It's for the 2% raises. It's for the laminated certificate. It's for clean house. It's for you scrolling your phone while you fired me. Call it an idiot tax, Dallas, and you are, unfortunately for you, in a very high bracket." Voss's jaw tightened, but I watched him do the math too. The real math, the math that mattered. $60,000 against a federal financial crimes investigation that could, if handled badly, end not just his career but potentially his freedom, and end Meridian Crest Capital's ability to ever raise another fund again. $60,000 against that was not a negotiation. It was a rounding error, and he knew it, and I knew he knew it, and the porch grew very quiet again while he decided whether his pride was worth more than his liberty. "Fine," Voss said, the word coming out of him like a tooth being pulled. "We'll wire it. Today." "You'll wire it in the next 30 minutes, I said, "or I'm going inside to take a nap, and Agent Whitfield and I are going to have a very thorough conversation on Friday with absolutely no help from either of you." Dallas pulled out his phone with hands that were, I noted with a professional's eye for detail, visibly shaking, and began tapping through what I assumed was Halloway Mutual's corporate banking application, cursing under his breath in a way that suggested this was not a transaction he was authorized to make alone, and that several increasingly frantic calls to someone else in the company's finance department were about to become necessary. I sipped my iced tea and watched a bee investigate my rose bushes with far more diligence than Bryson had apparently applied to the underwriting exception log. 12 minutes later, my phone buzzed. A banking notification. Pending deposit, $60,000. "There," Dallas said, in the voice of a man who had just amputated his own arm to stop the bleeding. "Now can you please help us before Friday?" "I can," I said. "But there's one more thing, and I want you both to understand this is not negotiable." "What?" Voss said, Wary now, the way you get wary of a woman who has already proven twice in one conversation that she knows more than you do. Whatever I find between now and Friday, whatever documentation, whatever irregularities, whatever's already in my possession from before you fired me, all of it goes to Agent Whitfield, regardless of what I'm doing for the company, I said. I will help Holloway Mutual survive this. I will help the state examination close cleanly, because there are 300 employees in that building who did nothing wrong and don't deserve to lose their jobs because of a scheme they never knew existed. But I am not, and I want to be extremely clear about this. Going to help either one of you hide anything from a federal investigation. You are paying for triage. You are not paying for a cover-up. If that's not the arrangement you're looking for, I suggest you get in your very nice cars and find a different accountant. And good luck finding one on 4 days' notice who has the paper trail I have. Voss looked at Dallas. Dallas looked at his shoes, which, I noted, were a much nicer pair than the sneakers from the fishbowl, purchased, I would later learn from Deb, specifically for this visit, because apparently, even a man having the worst week of his professional life still finds time to consider his footwear. Fine, Voss said again. And this time the word had a different texture to it. The texture of a man who has just realized he is no longer in control of any part of this situation, and is now simply trying to survive it with as little further damage as possible. When can you start? I already started, I said. I started the moment you two got out of your cars. Now get off my porch. I have a filing cabinet to reorganize, and gentlemen, it is going to take me a while, because unlike some people, I actually read the fine print. Friday morning, Agent Desmond Whitfield showed up at my house at 9 sharp, which I appreciated because I have very little patience for people who can't respect a scheduled appointment, a trait that had served me well for 2 decades and had apparently gone entirely unmissed by the last man who fired me. He was not what I expected. I had built up, over the preceding days, a mental image assembled entirely from television, all trench coats and clipped menacing dialogue, and what showed up on my porch instead was a tired-looking man in his late 40s with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, a government-issue sedan that badly needed a wash, and the specific, weary politeness of a man who has spent 15 years reading other people's spreadsheets for a living and has made peace with the fact that nobody will ever make a movie about it. "Ms. March," he said, shaking my hand, "thank you for having me. I understand you might have quite a bit to go through." "You have no idea," I said, and I led him to my dining room table where I had, over the previous 2 days, laid out what I privately thought of as the greatest hits. 26 months of related party payment records between Holloway Mutual and Claris Point Advisory. A printed and annotated copy of the MC Strategic Sync meeting invites Deb had helped me piece together, the Ohio business filings connecting Corbin Ash to Ash Family Holdings and the trust benefiting Dallas Kepler's wife, and, because I am nothing if not thorough, a similar pattern I had found, once I knew what to look for, at 2 prior companies Meridian Crest Capital had acquired and later sold, both of which had, coincidentally, according to public court records, faced regulatory trouble within 18 months of the sale closing. Trouble that surfaced only after Meridian Crest was long gone. Agent Whitfield spent 4 hours at my dining room table. He drank 3 cups of coffee. He asked, I want to say, maybe 200 questions, and every single one of them was precise, careful. The kind of question that told me he already half knew the answer and was checking my version against his own file, which I later learned was considerably thicker than I'd assumed, because the FBI, it turns out, had already been quietly looking at Meridian Crest Capital for the better part of a year, following a tip from an entirely different portfolio company in a different state. And my documentation didn't start the investigation, it simply gave it a spine. "Ms. March," he said finally, closing his notebook, "I want to be honest with you. In 15 years doing this, I have rarely seen documentation this organized handed to me by a civilian. Most of the time, we're piecing together fragments from 6 different sources over 18 months. You've basically handed me a finished case file with a table of contents." "I've been doing this a long time, Agent Whitfield," I said. "I've buried other people's mistakes so well that even I sometimes forget where I put them. But I never once threw anything away. That's the difference between me and everyone else in that building. I understood a long time ago that the people who make the mess are never the ones who get blamed for it. The people who get blamed are whoever's holding the paperwork when someone finally decides to look." He looked at me for a long moment, and something in his tired, careful face softened just slightly. "For what it's worth," he said, standing up and gathering the folders I had prepared for him, each one labeled in my own precise handwriting. "The world needs more people like you. Boring, meticulous, unglamorous people who write everything down. You're the reason any of this ever comes to light. Everyone wants to be the hero who catches the bad guy in a dramatic confrontation. Nobody wants to be the person who spent 6 years quietly filing the paperwork that made the confrontation possible." I walked him to his sedan. Before he got in, he turned back. "There will likely be a grand jury at some point," he said. "You may be asked to testify. I know that's not a small thing to ask of someone." "Agent Whitfield," I said, "I spent 22 years being the only adult in a building full of people playing pretend. Testifying under oath about a spreadsheet sounds, frankly, like a vacation." He laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of him, and drove away, and I stood on my porch for a long moment afterward, watching the dust settle on my gravel driveway, feeling lighter than I had felt in longer than I could accurately remember. The following Monday, exactly 2 weeks after Dallas Kepler told me to clean house, I walked back into Holloway Mutual's headquarters for the first time since security had watched me carry a cardboard box to my car. I did not walk in as an employee. I walked in as a $12,000 a day consultant, wearing a sharp navy suit I hadn't worn since my divorce lawyer told me to dress like a woman who doesn't need anyone's permission. Carrying a leather bag with a physical security key, a stack of paper files, and, because some habits die hard, my old coffee mug, the one that says, "I survived an audit and all I got was this ulcer." Because I have found over the years that a well-placed prop does wonders for morale, mostly mine. The receptionist, a sweet young woman named Talia, who I'd always liked, actually gasped when I walked through the door, the way you'd gasp seeing someone you'd been told had moved to another country. Word travels fast in a building where nobody has anything to do but wait for the ceiling to fall in. And by the time I reached the elevator, I could feel the whole floor watching. The particular hush of a workplace that has heard a legend is walking among them. Ms. Okonkwo-Barrett and her 2 colleagues were already set up in the largest conference room on the compliance floor. Not the fishbowl, thankfully. A room with real walls and a door that closed, surrounded by boxes of documents that Bryson and the remaining Claris Point staff had clearly been assembling with the focused desperation of people bailing water out of a sinking boat with a teaspoon. Bryson himself was there, looking, I will be generous and say, deeply out of his depth. A 26-year-old in an ill-fitting suit, surrounded by 3 ring binders he had almost certainly never opened before that week. "Ms. March," Ms. Okonkwo-Barrett said, standing to shake my hand, and I noted the genuine relief in her voice. The relief of a professional who has spent 2 weeks trying to build a coherent picture out of scattered, half-explained fragments, and has finally been handed someone who speaks the same language she does. We understand you may have some historical context that could help move this along. I have all the historical context, I said, setting my bag down on the table with a deliberate, satisfying thud. Where would you like to start? I'd suggest the commercial policy denial patterns from 2019 through 2021, since I suspect that's where the underwriting exception questions are coming from, and then we can move to the related party vendor structure, since I imagine that's where things are about to get considerably more interesting. I spent the next 3 days in that conference room, walking Ms. Okonkwo-Barrett and her team through 7 years of institutional history with the specific, methodical calm of a surgeon who has done this exact procedure 100 times and has simply been waiting for someone competent enough to hand her the right instruments. I explained the 2011 hailstorm denials and how they'd been remediated. I explained the underwriting exception protocols, why they existed, and exactly which files fell legitimately under them versus which of the recent denials, processed hastily by an outsourced, undertrained vendor in the 2 weeks since my departure, did not. I laid out, methodically, with dates and dollar figures, the entire related party structure connecting Claris Point Advisory to Dallas Kepler's family, and how it had compromised the company's ability to maintain independent compliance oversight during a critical regulatory window, which, I should mention, is its own kind of violation, separate and distinct from anything the state examiners had originally come looking for. Dallas hovered near the door for most of the first day, the way a man hovers near a car accident he caused, unable to leave and unable to help. By the second day, he had stopped coming at all. By the third day, Deb informed me, via a text sent from the stairwell with her usual theatrical discretion, that Dallas had not been seen on the executive floor since the previous evening, and that his office door had a small, hand-lettered sign taped to it that simply read, "In meetings," which everyone on the floor understood to mean hiding. On Thursday afternoon, Ms. Okonkwo-Barrett closed her final binder, took off her reading glasses, and looked at me across a conference table covered in 7 years of paper that I had, alone, understood in its entirety. "Ms. March," she said, "I want to be direct with you because I think you'd prefer that to diplomacy. In 22 years doing this job, I have walked into companies expecting to find a mess and found instead a company that appears to have been extraordinarily well managed until very recently by someone who clearly took this work seriously in a way that's genuinely rare. The historical claims handling practices are sound. The documentation, once properly organized and presented, more than substantiates the company's compliance with underwriting guidelines. We'll be closing this examination with a finding of no material violation on the historical conduct. However," and here her voice took on a different, sharper tone, the tone of a woman about to write something down that would matter for a very long time, "we will be issuing a formal citation regarding the governance failure surrounding the transition to Claris Point Advisory. Specifically, the undisclosed related party conflict of interest and the 2-week lapse in independent compliance oversight during an active investigation window. That will be referred separately to both state and federal authorities for further review." Dallas, who had reappeared for this final meeting, presumably summoned by someone above him who needed a body in the room to absorb the blow, made a sound I can only describe as the air slowly leaving a very expensive balloon. "No fines on the historical conduct," Ms. Okonkwo-Barrett continued, "is entirely due to the documentation Ms. March provided. I want that on the record. Without it, this examination would have taken considerably longer, and given the state of the files we found on arrival, I am not confident it would have ended the same way." I did not gloat. I want you to know that. I did not stand up and take a bow. I simply nodded, closed my own folder, and said, "I try." But I want to be honest with you, since I promised at the beginning I always would be. I gloated a little, internally, in the specific, quiet, load-bearing part of my chest where I keep every 2% raise and every laminated certificate I've ever received, and I let myself enjoy it, fully, without apology, for the first time in 22 years. The board meeting happened the following Tuesday, and I was not in the room for it, but I got the play-by-play from 3 separate sources within about 90 minutes of it ending, because I have found that the truth of a company always travels fastest through the people who were never invited to help create it. Holloway Mutual, it turned out, still had 2 independent board members from the old Walt Holloway days, holdovers from before Meridian Crest bought in, men who had spent the past 8 months quietly uneasy about the direction things had taken, and who had, according to Deb, who heard it from Priyanka, who heard it from someone in legal, been the ones who insisted on the emergency session the moment the state examiner's preliminary findings landed on their desks. Dallas Kepler was terminated that afternoon for cause, which matters a great deal in a severance conversation, because for cause is the corporate equivalent of being told there's no golden parachute, only a rapidly approaching floor. He was escorted from the building by the same security guard, a kind, weathered man named Otis, who had worked the front desk for as long as I'd worked in compliance, and who, according to Deb, who watched the whole thing from the lobby with the rapt attention of a woman who had waited 19 years for a moment exactly like this one, said only one thing to Dallas on his way out the door. "Have a good one, son," Otis reportedly said, in a tone Deb described as somehow both extremely polite and extremely final. And I have thought about that phrase more than I probably should, because I think it captures something true about how the universe eventually settles its accounts. Quietly, politely, and with absolutely no interest in your feelings about the matter. Reginald Voss did not attend the board meeting in person. He resigned his position as managing partner of Meridian Crest Capital 11 days later in a brief, carefully worded statement about pursuing other opportunities, which, if you've been paying attention throughout this story, you will recognize as the exact same phrase used to describe Perry the son-in-law's departure back in 2016. Which tells you that some sentences are simply reused across the entire history of corporate cowardice, passed down like a family recipe nobody wants to admit they use. I was contacted, 2 days after Dallas's termination, by the same 2 independent board members, a soft-spoken retired judge named Harriet Okafor-Lint, no relation to Deb as far as either of us could determine despite an entertaining 10 minutes trying to figure it out, and a gruff former manufacturing executive named Cal Bergstrom, who I'd met exactly twice in 22 years, and who had, both times, struck me as one of the only genuinely serious people in any room he occupied. "Vivian," Judge Okafor-Lint said, over coffee, in a small cafe near the courthouse that she'd specifically chosen because, in her words, "I don't trust a single conference room in that building anymore. We'd like to offer you the position of Chief Compliance Officer, reporting directly to the board with full independence from the executive team. Whatever compensation makes this right, we're prepared to discuss it seriously, not as a negotiating tactic, but because we've finally understood what we lost." I sat with that offer for a long moment, turning it over the way I turn over everything, looking for the crack in it, because 22 years teaches you to distrust anything that sounds too clean on first hearing. But I looked, and looked again, and I didn't find one. It was, genuinely, a sincere offer, made by two people who had watched the alternative nearly sink a 140-year-old company and who understood, in a way Dallas Kepler never had, exactly what they'd be losing if they let me walk away a second time. "I appreciate it," I said, and I meant it. "But no." Cal Bergstrom raised an eyebrow. "Can I ask why?" "Because I spent 22 years being the person who cleans up other people's messes and gets a laminated certificate for it," I said. "I'm 51 years old. I don't want to be the janitor anymore, even a well-paid one with a fancy title and board-level independence. What I'll do, gladly, is stay on as an independent consultant, on retainer, at a rate that reflects what just happened, available to review anything material before it becomes a problem, with full authority to escalate directly to the two of you, no executive layer in between. I get my life back. You get the same protection you just watched me provide for free, except this time you're paying for it properly, and this time, God willing, nobody ever tells me to clean house on my way out the door again." They agreed. The retainer, I will tell you, since I've been honest with you this whole time, was considerably more than my old salary had been, for considerably fewer hours. And I want you to sit with that for a moment, because it's the whole moral of the story if you're looking for one. The market rate for the person who actually knows where the bodies are buried is always higher than the salary a company was paying while they still had the luxury of pretending they didn't need her. 6 weeks later, I read in the Wall Street Journal, at my kitchen table, with my second cup of coffee, that the Department of Justice had filed civil fraud charges against Meridian Crest Capital, Reginald Voss personally, and a related entity controlled by Corbin Ash, alleging a pattern of related party self-dealing across at least 4 portfolio companies over 6 years. A parallel criminal investigation, the article noted, citing a source familiar with the matter, remained ongoing. Dallas Kepler was mentioned in paragraph 11, described only as a former chief financial officer at one of the affected companies, which felt, honestly, like exactly the right amount of significance to grant him. A footnote in someone else's much larger crime. I clipped that article. I put it in the vault, next to the FBI's business card and a printed copy of my first consulting invoice. It felt, in a way I hadn't quite expected, less like a trophy and more like a receipt. Proof of a debt finally, properly collected, after 22 years of being told that the collecting wasn't my job, only the cleaning up. I want to tell you what happened to the people in this story, because I know that's the part you actually came for, past the schadenfreude of a man in bad sneakers getting his comeuppance. The part where you want to know if the universe really does keep its books balanced, or if that's just something we tell ourselves to get through a Tuesday. Bryson Cole, the 26-year-old Claris Point consultant who thought a filing cabinet was a metaphor, actually turned out fine. And I want to give credit where it's due, because this story has enough villains in it without me manufacturing an extra one out of a kid who was, honestly, just as disposable to Meridian Crest's scheme as I nearly was. Once Claris Point's contract was terminated, which happened within a week of the board meeting, Bryson reached out to me directly, sheepishly, asking if I had any advice for someone trying to actually break into compliance work the right way. I liked that he asked. I liked it enough that I spent an unpaid Saturday afternoon walking him through the basics of an actual underwriting exception log, and I liked it enough that, 8 months later, when my consulting practice had grown past the point where I could handle every engagement personally, I hired him, part-time, to help with document review, at a fair wage, with the explicit understanding that if I ever caught him calling a filing cabinet a metaphor again, he was fired on the spot. He has not called anything a metaphor since. He's actually quite good, once you strip away the LinkedIn buzzwords and teach him to read paragraph 9. Deb Okafor retired 11 months after all of this, with a full pension and, I am pleased to report, a proper send-off complete with a cake shaped like a filing cabinet, which she found the funniest thing that had ever happened to her, and which she photographed from at least 6 angles before allowing anyone to cut into it. She now spends her days doing exactly what she always threatened to do, which is smoking on a porch of her own and calling me twice a week to report in exhaustive and gleeful detail on which of her former coworkers has done something recently stupid enough to be worth narrating. Priyanka, the HR woman who couldn't meet my eyes in the fishbowl, left Holloway Mutual about 4 months after Dallas's termination, not because anything further happened to her, but because, in her words, over coffee I insisted on buying her, I just couldn't stop thinking about how easily I could have been the one holding that folder for the next person. She's in HR at a nonprofit now, making considerably less money, and by her own account, sleeping considerably better. Otis, the security guard, is still at the front desk of Holloway Mutual, still kind, still weathered, and according to Deb, has become something of a legend among the newer hires, who have all heard some version of the story about the day he told a fired CFO to "have a good one, son," on his way out the door. A story that has grown, in the retelling, considerably more dramatic than the actual 30 seconds it took to happen, which I think is exactly how legends are supposed to work. Dallas Kepler. And I want you to sit with this one, because it is somehow both the least surprising and most satisfying detail in this entire saga. Spent about 4 months unemployed before reinventing himself, and I am not making this up, as a financial freedom coach on social media, posting videos from what appears to be a rented lake house about the importance of disrupting legacy thinking and embracing radical career pivots, none of which mention the words federal referral or fired for cause, and all of which have, as of the last time Deb checked for me out of pure undiluted spite, somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 views. I do not follow him. Deb follows him extensively, on a burner account she made specifically for this purpose, and reports back weekly with the diligence of a woman running a full-time intelligence operation on a man who genuinely does not deserve this much of her attention. And I love her for it more than I could ever adequately express. Reginald Voss, last I heard, through the same Wall Street Journal reporter who wrote the original piece, and who has, over the past year, become something of a pen pal, given how many of my documents ended up cited, anonymously, as records provided by a former employee of an affected company, is currently negotiating a settlement with the Department of Justice that will very likely include a substantial fine, a lifetime bar from serving as an officer or director of any investment advisory firm, and, depending on how the parallel criminal matter resolves, the very real possibility of prison time. Meridian Crest Capital has effectively ceased operations. Its remaining portfolio companies were sold off, one by one, over the following year. Several of them, I am told, to buyers who insisted, as a condition of the sale, on a full independent compliance review conducted by an outside firm, and I want you to guess, just for fun, which outside firm several of them ended up hiring. Corbin Ash, Dallas's brother-in-law, has, as far as I can determine through entirely legal public records research that has, admittedly, become something of a hobby, relocated to a state with no extradition treaty complications that I'm aware of. Though I want to be careful here, because I am a compliance consultant, not a gossip columnist, even though I recognize that at this point in the story, the line has gotten a little blurry, and I'm choosing not to apologize for that. I started my consulting practice properly about 3 months after the board meeting, once the retainer with Holloway Mutual was formalized, and word had started to spread, quietly, the way these things do, through the specific gossip network of insurance industry professionals who all seemed to know each other from a conference in Columbus a decade ago. I named it March Compliance Partners, which I recognize is not a particularly clever name, but I have found, over the course of a long career, that cleverness is a luxury best left to people who haven't yet had to explain to a federal examiner why a decimal point was in the wrong place. I wanted a name that sounded exactly like what it was: boring, precise, and load-bearing. Within a year, I had 4 employees, including Bryson, a modest office above a bakery that fills the whole building with the smell of cinnamon every morning, which I consider a not insignificant perk after 22 years of burnt boardroom coffee. And the client roster made up almost entirely of mid-sized companies who had learned, usually the hard way, exactly how expensive it is to treat a compliance department like an overhead line item instead of a fire suppression system. I charge, I will be honest with you, a genuinely absurd hourly rate, one that would have made the old me blush to even say out loud. And I have never once had a client blink at the invoice, because every single one of them found me after already having lived through the version of this story where nobody caught the problem in time. One of my favorite clients, and I'll tell you about her because I think you've earned a happy ending that isn't just about revenge, was a woman named Carol Fentress, who owned a small regional trucking insurance brokerage her father had built from nothing, and who called me in an absolute panic one Tuesday morning because a routine state audit had turned up a discrepancy in her agent licensing records that she genuinely, honestly, had no idea existed. The result of a well-meaning but sloppy office manager who had let renewal paperwork lapse for 3 separate agents over 2 years without telling anyone. Carol was terrified. Carol thought she was going to lose the business her father had spent 30 years building over a filing error nobody had caught. I spent 4 days with Carol, going through every file, every license, every renewal date, building the exact kind of clean, honest, well-organized documentation that turns a terrifying discovery into a manageable correction. We self-reported the lapse to the state before the examiner even asked, with a full remediation plan already attached, which is a move that, in my experience, transforms a regulator's posture almost instantly from adversary to something closer to a relieved colleague. Carol got a warning letter and a corrective action plan instead of a suspended license. She cried in my office when it was over, not from fear this time, but from the specific relief of a person who has just watched someone catch her before she hit the ground. "How do I ever repay you?" she asked. And I told her the truth, which is that she already had, by the simple, rare act of calling me the moment she was scared, instead of 6 months later once the problem had metastasized into something unfixable. I think about Carol sometimes when I think about what this whole ordeal was actually about, underneath the schadenfreude and the $60,000 wire transfer and the FBI agent at my dining room table. It was never really about revenge, not in the end, even though revenge is the part that makes for a good story, the part I know you clicked on this video for, and I don't blame you, because I would have clicked on it too. It was about the fact that somewhere along the way, a whole generation of executives convinced themselves that the people who catch the mistakes are a cost to be minimized, instead of the entire reason the building is still standing. And I got to spend one very satisfying year proving, in extremely expensive detail, exactly how wrong that math is. My son, Theo, who is 26 now and works in software engineering 3 states away and had absolutely no involvement in any of this beyond calling me every Sunday to ask how the whole IRS thing was going, which tells you exactly how much detail I've given him over the phone versus how much I'm telling you right now, flew home the week the Wall Street Journal article ran, ostensibly to help me process everything, which really meant he wanted to sit at my kitchen table and read the article out loud in increasingly delighted disbelief. "Mom," he said at one point, looking up from his phone with an expression somewhere between pride and mild concern, "you basically ended a private equity firm." "I provided documentation," I said. "What they did with the documentation was between them and the Department of Justice." "You have an FBI agent's cell phone number," he said. "I have several people's cell phone numbers, Theo," I said. "I have a very organized contacts app. It's part of why any of this worked." He laughed for a long time at that. The real laugh. The one I hadn't heard from him since he was a teenager. And then he got quiet and said something that I think about more than almost anything else that happened that entire year. "I used to feel bad for you, a little," he said. "Growing up, you worked so hard and it never seemed like anyone noticed. I remember that stupid laminated certificate on the fridge. I used to think, is this really what being good at your job gets you?" "And now?" I asked. "Now I think," he said, "you were just waiting for the right idiot to fire you." He wasn't entirely wrong, though I'd correct him on one small point, since accuracy matters to me in all things. I wasn't waiting. I would have been perfectly content to spend the rest of my career quietly catching everyone's mistakes and collecting my 2% raises in relative peace. I never wanted this particular fight. But I had spent 22 years building the exact set of skills required to win it decisively the moment somebody was foolish enough to start one. And there is a version of justice in that too. A slower, less cinematic kind. The justice of simply being competent and patient and thorough for long enough that when the universe finally does call your number, you're the only person in the room who actually knows how to answer. I want to back up for a moment and tell you about the grand jury, because I promised you the whole story and I don't believe in skipping the parts that made my hands shake, even months later. Even now, sitting here telling you about it with the comfortable distance of hindsight. It happened about 5 months after everything with Dallas and Voss first blew up, on a gray Tuesday in a federal courthouse 2 hours from my house, in a windowless room that smelled like old carpet and nervous sweat, though notably less like the nervous sweat and cheap cologne that used to define Dallas's presence in a room, which I suppose was its own small mercy. I had never testified before a grand jury in my life. I had, in 22 years, testified in exactly one deposition for a slip-and-fall claim in 2014, and I remember being nervous then over a soaked welcome mat and a twisted ankle. This was, understandably, a different order of magnitude entirely. Agent Whitfield met me outside the courtroom, in a hallway lined with the specific fluorescent lighting that seems engineered in every federal building I have ever been in to make everyone look slightly guilty of something. He looked, if anything, more tired than he had at my dining room table. The particular exhaustion of a man who had spent 5 months building a case brick by brick and was now watching the whole structure finally get tested. "You'll be fine," he said, which is the kind of thing people say right before something is not, in fact, entirely fine. But I appreciated the gesture. "Just answer what's asked. Don't volunteer. Don't guess. If you don't remember something, say you don't remember it." "Agent Whitfield," I said, "I have never once in my professional life failed to remember something I wrote down myself, in triplicate, with a date and a dollar amount attached. I think I'll manage." He laughed, the same surprised laugh from my kitchen table, and it steadied me more than any of his actual advice had. The grand jury room itself was smaller than I expected, less theatrical. 23 ordinary citizens sitting in rows of folding chairs, looking, frankly, exactly as bored and uncomfortable as any 23 people forced to sit in a windowless room for hours listening to testimony about related party transaction structures would look. A federal prosecutor, a sharp, soft-spoken woman named Renata Ibarra, walked me through nearly 3 hours of questions, methodically, patiently, building the same story I've told you here, except with none of the jokes and considerably more citations to specific exhibit numbers. I want to tell you about one exchange in particular, because it's the moment that has stayed with me the longest, longer even than the porch confrontation, longer than the $60,000 wire transfer notification lighting up my phone. "Ms. March," Ibarra asked near the end of the session, "in your professional opinion, having worked in this field for over 2 decades, was the transition of Halloway Mutual's compliance function to Claris Point Advisory, given the timing and the undisclosed relationship you've described, consistent with a legitimate cost restructuring decision or something else?" I thought about that question for a long moment, longer than any other question that day, because I wanted to get it exactly right. Not for drama, but because I understood, sitting in that room, that my answer was going to become a permanent part of a federal record, the kind of sentence that outlives the person who says it. "In 22 years," I said, "I have seen legitimate cost restructuring. It's slow, it's documented, it involves a transition period, knowledge transfer, and usually a fair amount of arguing about severance packages. What I experienced was not that. What I experienced was a company installing a firm secretly controlled by the decision-maker's own family at the exact moment 2 active regulatory investigations required independent oversight, and doing it with such urgency that the person being replaced was walked out of the building in 20 minutes without being permitted to hand off a single file. That's not restructuring, Ms. Ibarra. That's evidence tampering with better branding." One of the grand jurors, an older man in the back row who had spent most of the previous 3 hours looking like he'd rather be doing literally anything else, actually laughed out loud at that. A short, startled bark of a laugh, before catching himself and looking apologetically at the judge's empty chair, since grand jury proceedings don't actually have a judge present, a fact I found oddly disappointing given how much television had prepared me to expect one. I left the courthouse that afternoon feeling something I can only describe as a strange, quiet closure. The sensation of finally setting down a bag I hadn't fully realized I'd been carrying for months. The indictments, when they finally came down 4 weeks later, were extensive. Wire fraud, securities fraud, conspiracy, and a handful of charges specific enough in their legal language that I had to read them twice with a dictionary open beside me, which, for a woman who reads federal regulations recreationally, tells you something about how thoroughly Voss and Ash had built their scheme. Dallas Kepler was not indicted. I want to be honest about that, too, because I promised you the whole truth and not just the satisfying parts. The prosecutors determined, ultimately, that Dallas had been reckless, self-interested, and catastrophically negligent, but that his conduct, while it had enabled the larger fraud, did not itself rise to the level of criminal intent required for federal charges, largely because, in a detail I find almost unbearably poetic, he genuinely had not understood the full scope of what his brother-in-law's firm was actually doing with the access he'd granted them. Dallas Kepler, in the end, was not clever enough to be a criminal. He was simply arrogant enough to be useful to one, which I have come to believe, the more I've thought about it, is its own kind of quiet, permanent punishment. To have burned your entire career down in service of a scheme you weren't even smart enough to fully understand. I should tell you about Marla, because I promised you at the start that I was going to be honest with you. And it would be dishonest to let you think this whole year was only about spreadsheets and subpoenas, when really, underneath all of that, it was also the year I finally, properly, became friends with the 81-year-old woman who has been watching my life unfold over a chain-link fence for over a decade. Marla, if you'll recall, is the one who leaned over that fence the first Saturday after I was fired and asked if I'd finally killed my husband, which, for the record, I divorced amicably enough 8 years earlier that Gary and I still exchange Christmas cards. Though I'll admit, the timing of her question, delivered while smoking a cigarette longer than her forearm, has become one of my favorite memories of that entire strange season. Marla, it turns out, spent 31 years as a claims adjuster herself, back in an era before any of the systems I spent my career building even existed. Back when everything was done on paper and a good adjuster's entire reputation rested on the strength of her handwriting and her memory. She never told me this in all the years I'd lived next to her. She told me, 2 weeks into the whole ordeal, sitting on my back porch with a glass of the same bourbon I keep for emergencies, after I'd finally explained, in broad strokes, what exactly had happened at Halloway Mutual. "Honey," she said, taking a long drag and exhaling toward my roses like she'd done 100 times before. "I spent 3 decades watching young men like your Dallas walk in thinking the job was easy because the woman doing it made it look easy. That's not new. That's not even interesting. What's interesting is you had the sense to keep the paper." "You kept paper too?" I asked. "Honey," she said again, in the tone of a woman revealing a much larger secret than I was prepared for. "I've got 4 filing cabinets in my basement from a company that dissolved in 1994. I never threw a single sheet away. You think I don't know exactly why you keep that ridiculous locked cabinet in your office? I recognized it the day you moved in. Same brand I used, same lock even. We're the same animal, Vivian. We just got born 40 years apart." I have thought about that conversation more than almost any other in this entire story. More than the porch confrontation with Voss and Dallas. More than the grand jury testimony. Because it reframed something for me that I hadn't quite let myself see clearly before. That I was never some singular anomaly, some unusually vindictive woman who happened to stumble into the right set of circumstances to burn a private equity firm to the ground. I was part of a long, mostly invisible lineage of women who had spent entire careers being underestimated by exactly the kind of men who eventually needed us to save them. Women who learned, generation after generation, the same quiet lesson. Keep the paper, keep the receipts, keep the proof. Because eventually, reliably, predictably, someone is going to try to tell you that the mess you cleaned up never happened. And on that day, you are going to need something more solid than your own word. Marla and I have dinner together most Thursdays now. She still smokes on my porch. I still pour the bourbon a little heavier than I probably should. We talk about roses and old grudges, and, increasingly, about the small consulting side projects she's started helping me with, reviewing historical claims files for clients who need someone who remembers how things were actually done before every system got digitized and every institutional memory got quietly deleted along with the servers that used to hold it. She refuses payment. She says watching young executives squirm is payment enough, and honestly, having watched her in a room with a nervous 30-something CFO exactly once, I believe her completely. There's a version of this story, the version I think Dallas and Voss and Reginald and all the men like them would tell, where the moral is simply, don't underestimate people. delivered as a kind of cautionary business school anecdote, the sort of thing that gets turned into a bullet point on a leadership seminar slide next to a stock photo of a chessboard. I don't think that's actually the lesson, though. I think the lesson is something a little less comfortable for men like that to sit with, which is that an entire economy has been quietly built on the assumption that certain kinds of work and certain kinds of people, mostly women, mostly over 40, mostly unglamorous, unphotogenic, unthought leadership adjacent, are disposable, replaceable, outdatable. Right up until the exact moment the roof is about to cave in, at which point those same people turn out to be the only ones who know where the support beams are. I didn't win because I was clever, though I like to think I'm reasonably clever. I won because I was patient for 22 years, in a way our entire culture actively discourages, in a way that gets you called a dinosaur, a relic, resistant to change, right up until the moment your patience is the only thing standing between a company and federal prison. It's been a little over a year now since the fishbowl, since the folder on the table and the phrase, "clean house," and my knee popping like a gunshot in that glass-walled silence. I want to give you the update, the way any good storyteller circles back around at the end to show you where everyone landed, because I know you've been patient with me through all the paperwork and the federal referrals, and you've earned a proper ending. Holloway Mutual is still standing. It's smaller than it was, having shed 2 lines of business that Meridian Crest had inflated with the exact kind of aggressive, poorly documented underwriting that eventually gets a company in trouble. But it's healthier, in the way a body is healthier after finally passing a kidney stone that had been quietly poisoning it for months. Judge Okafor Lint and Cal Bergstrom brought in a new CEO from outside, a soft-spoken, competent woman named Adeze Nwosu, who has, in her first year, done something I genuinely did not expect from anyone in that building ever again. She called me, personally, within her first month, not to ask me to come back full-time, but simply to ask what I thought the company was still getting wrong. I gave her a list. She acted on every single item on it within a quarter. I have never, in 22 years plus one very eventful extra year, worked with an executive who did that. And I want you to notice, because I think it matters, that the difference between Adeze and Dallas was never intelligence. Dallas was not a stupid man, whatever satisfaction it gives us both to say so. The difference was that Adeze understood, on some fundamental level Dallas never reached, that the people who catch your mistakes are not an obstacle to your success. They are the entire infrastructure of it. March Compliance Partners now has 9 employees, a second office 2 towns over, and a client list I am, I'll admit, unreasonably proud of, including, in a twist I did not see coming and genuinely enjoy every single time I think about it, 2 other former portfolio companies of Meridian Crest Capital, both of which hired me specifically because their new owners, post-acquisition, wanted an outside firm with, and I am quoting directly from the engagement letter here, no prior relationship with the previous ownership group's advisory network, which is corporate legal language for, we heard what you did to the last guy, and we would very much like that energy on our side of the table this time. Bryson passed his professional compliance certification exam 8 months ago on his second attempt, having failed the first one rather spectacularly, in a way he now tells the story of himself, at office happy hours, with a self-deprecating charm that makes me genuinely fond of him, despite my better judgment. He asked me to be his reference for the exam board. I said yes, on the condition that he never, under any circumstances, ever again refer to a filing cabinet as a metaphor for anything. He has kept his word. Deb calls every Tuesday now, having apparently decided that Tuesday forever belongs to us, A small private joke about the day this whole thing started that neither of us has ever needed to explain out loud. Last week, she informed me, with the breathless delight of a woman who has found her true calling in retirement, that Dallas's financial freedom coaching account had been suspended for what the platform vaguely described as coordinated inauthentic engagement, which I understand to mean he'd been buying followers, and which Deb described, memorably, as the most on-brand thing that man has ever done in his entire life. Reginald Voss pleaded guilty 8 weeks ago to a reduced set of federal charges as part of a deal that will keep him out of prison, but will bar him permanently from the securities industry and cost him, according to the settlement terms that became public record, north of $30 million in fines and disgorgement, a number that I have found, on the particularly bad days when I still feel a flicker of the old anger from that fishbowl, brings me a strange and entirely unearned amount of comfort. Corbin Ash's case is, as of this recording, still pending, and I am, per my agreement with Agent Whitfield, saying nothing further about it, except to note that I check my email every single morning with a small, private hope that today is the day I hear something new. I sit on my back porch most evenings now, the way I did that first Tuesday, watching the light change over my roses, which are, this year, doing better than they have in a decade, because I have finally had the time to actually take care of them properly, instead of pruning in a 15-minute window between conference calls. Theo visits more than he used to. Marla still leans over the fence most mornings with a cigarette and an opinion. My mug still says, "I survived an audit and all I got was this ulcer," though I've retired it to a shelf now, replaced in daily use by a new one Bryson gave me for my last birthday, which simply says, in plain block letters, "The Cleaner," which is what my team started calling me sometime during the Claire's Point mess, and which stuck, the way the best nicknames always do, without anyone ever formally deciding it should. I want to leave you with one more story before I wrap this up, because I think it captures something true about how the whole ordeal changed me in ways that had nothing to do with money or vindication, and everything to do with something quieter, something I'm still, honestly, getting used to. About 4 months ago, I got a call from a young woman named Priya Deshmukh, 29 years old, working as a junior compliance analyst at a regional healthcare billing company. A woman I had never met, who had found my name through an article about the Meridian Crest settlement, and had apparently spent an entire weekend reading every public document connected to my name that she could find, which is either deeply flattering or extremely unsettling depending on the day I'm having when I think about it. She called my office, nervous, talking fast, the way you talk when you've rehearsed something in your head 50 times and are terrified it's going to come out wrong anyway. "I think something similar might be happening where I work," she said. "Not identical, but similar. And I don't know what to do because I'm not you. I don't have 22 years of paper backups. I don't have a locked filing cabinet. I'm 29, and I'm scared I'll get fired if I say anything. And I'm scared of what happens if I don't." I sat with that for a long moment, because I recognized something in her voice that I hadn't heard directed at myself in a very long time. The specific, raw fear of a person standing exactly where I stood 22 years earlier, before I'd learned any of the lessons that eventually saved me, before I'd built any of the systems that turned out to matter so much more than I ever expected them to. I didn't give her a speech about courage. I gave her something more useful, I think, which is the only genuinely transferable lesson from this entire year of my life. I told her to start writing things down. Not dramatically, not as evidence for a lawsuit she might never need to file, just as a practice, a habit, the way you'd keep a journal, except instead of feelings, you write down facts, dates, dollar amounts, names, who said what, in which meeting, and when. I told her that most people who eventually find themselves in trouble at work didn't get there because they lacked courage in the moment it mattered. They got there because they lacked documentation in all the moments before it mattered. When writing things down felt paranoid, felt excessive, felt like something only a difficult person would bother doing. "You're not being paranoid," I told her. "You're being an adult in a room full of people who are betting that nobody in the building is paying close enough attention to remember what actually happened. Be the person who remembers. That's it. That's the whole secret. It's not glamorous. Nobody's going to make a movie about you writing dates in a notebook. But in 5 years, if this ever actually blows up the way you're worried it might, you're going to be extremely, extremely glad you did it." She thanked me and hung up, and I sat at my desk for a while afterward, thinking about the fact that somewhere out there, a 29-year-old woman was about to start keeping her own version of the vault, her own locked cabinet, her own quiet insurance policy against a future she couldn't fully see yet. And that whatever else came out of this whole strange, expensive, occasionally terrifying year, that felt like the part worth being proudest of. Not the $60,000 wire transfer, not the grand jury testimony, not even the $30 million in fines that Reginald Voss is presumably still writing very large, very unhappy checks to cover. Just a scared young woman on the other end of a phone call, deciding to start writing things down. So here's where I'll leave you, because I think every story like this one needs an ending, even if the real ending, the boring, honest one, is just that life kept going the way it does. And I kept pruning my roses, and Marla kept smoking her cigarettes over the fence, and Holloway Mutual kept limping along towards something healthier than it used to be. And somewhere out there, a man in bad sneakers keeps posting videos about radical career pivots to an audience of 2,000 people who have absolutely no idea what he actually did to earn his expertise. I didn't set out to be anyone's cautionary tale, and I definitely didn't set out to be anyone's hero. I set out 22 years ago to be good at a job most people didn't understand and didn't respect. And I stayed good at it, patiently, quietly, for longer than was probably reasonable. Right up until the exact moment a 34-year-old man in sneakers decided that patience was outdated. He was wrong about that, the way he was wrong about almost everything. And I got to spend one very satisfying, very expensive year proving it, in excruciating, well-documented, federally referenced detail. If there's a moral here, and I know you've been sitting through this whole thing waiting for one, it's not really about revenge. Even though revenge, I'll admit, felt fantastic. It's this. The person who quietly keeps the receipts is never the person you should be laughing at when you fire her. She is, whether you realize it in time or not, the only reason you've lasted this long in the first place. Treat her badly on the way out the door, and you're not cutting a cost center. You're handing her a very expensive, very well-organized reason to finally stop protecting you. So that's the story. That's how a folder on a table and the phrase "clean house" turned into a federal fraud case, a retirement I didn't need, and a consulting rate that still makes me laugh a little every time I send an invoice. Don't ever tell the person holding the paperwork that she's disposable. And if you're ever tempted to fire someone at 4:15 on a Tuesday afternoon while scrolling your phone, do yourself a favor and check, very carefully, exactly what she's been quietly filing away for the last 22 years. because you might just be lighting the fuse on your own very expensive, very public, very well-documented downfall. Thanks for sticking with me through all of that. If you enjoyed it, you know what to do. Hit subscribe, hit the bell, and if you've ever been told to clean house by someone half as competent as the woman he was firing, drop it in the comments, because I read every single one, and honestly, at this point, I've got a whole new folder just for stories like yours. One last thing. Since you've been generous enough to stay with me this long, and since I promised you total honesty from the very first sentence, people ask me, more than almost anything else, whether I regret any of it, whether, looking back, I wish I'd handled Dallas differently that Tuesday afternoon, whether I wish I'd swallowed my pride, taken the badge off quietly, and let the chips fall wherever they were going to fall without my help or my hindrance either way. I don't. And I want to explain why, carefully, because I think it's the one part of this story that actually requires some nuance, some acknowledgement that revenge stories are satisfying precisely because they simplify something that, in real life, is rarely simple at all. I did not destroy Meridian Crest Capital. I want to be precise about that, because precision has been the entire engine of my career, and I'm not going to abandon it now, in the one story where I finally get to be the one telling it, instead of documenting someone else's. Meridian Crest Capital destroyed itself, over years, through a pattern of self-dealing and disregard for the people and institutions it was supposed to be stewarding responsibly. What I did was refuse to help them hide it any longer than they'd already managed to hide it themselves, and I kept the kind of records that made that refusal actually consequential instead of just satisfying. There's a difference, and I think it matters, between being an agent of destruction and simply being the last honest witness left standing when the whole structure finally came down under its own weight. I also want to tell you, because it would be dishonest not to, that there were nights that year when the weight of it all felt enormous, disproportionate to anything I'd signed up for. Testifying before a grand jury is not, whatever I joked about earlier, actually like a vacation. There were nights I lay awake wondering whether Corbin Ash's associates, whoever they turned out to be, might decide I was a loose end worth worrying about. Nights I checked my locks twice. Nights I called Theo just to hear his voice, and didn't tell him why. Nothing ever came of that fear, thankfully, but I want you to know it existed, because I think stories like this one too often skip the part where doing the right thing is also, quietly, frightening. Even when you're confident it's right. Even when you have a folder full of federal business cards to reassure you. What got me through those nights, more than anything else, was a version of the same thing that had gotten me through 22 years of quietly cleaning up other people's messes in the first place. The simple, stubborn conviction that somebody has to be the person who remembers what actually happened, and that if it isn't going to be me, a 51-year-old woman with a locked filing cabinet and a chip on her shoulder the size of a filing cabinet, then who, exactly, did I think it was going to be? Bryson, before I got hold of him, thought a filing cabinet was a metaphor. Dallas thought accountability was something that happened to other people, on someone else's spreadsheet, 18 months down the line. Somebody in every single one of these stories has to actually keep the paper. I decided, a long time before Dallas Kepler ever said the words clean house to me, that it was going to be me, every single time, whether anyone ever thanked me for it or not. They didn't thank me for 22 years. And then, all at once, in the space of about 6 months, the whole world seemed to catch up to what I'd known the entire time. That the boring woman with the paper files was never the redundancy. She was the load-bearing wall. You can renovate around a load-bearing wall. You can even, if you're arrogant enough, convince yourself for a while that you've modernized past needing it. But eventually, if you actually knock it down, the whole building comes with it, and there is nothing anyone can do at that point except stand in the rubble, take out their phone, and call the woman they fired, hoping, against every reasonable expectation, that she still has the blueprints. I did. I always did. I just decided finally, after 22 years, that this time, the blueprints were going to cost them everything they had left. And they did. P.S. Because I know some of you in the comments always ask this on stories like mine. No, I never did get an apology. Not a real one. Not from Dallas, not from Reginald Voss, not from anyone whose name appears anywhere in this story. The closest I ever got was a single voicemail left on my old work phone about 2 weeks after everything fell apart. A number I only heard because Deb, in one final act of gleeful loyalty, forwarded it to me before the line got disconnected for good. It was Dallas, and his voice was small in a way I had never once heard it. All the swagger gone, all the sneakers and the veneers and the synergy stripped away. Just a tired 34-year-old man talking into a dead phone line. "Vivian," the voicemail said, "I don't know if you'll ever hear this. I just wanted to say, I think I made a mistake. Not the fraud stuff. I mean, obviously that too, but I mean firing you the way I did. I think if I'd just talked to you like a person, none of this happens. I don't know. I hope you're doing okay." I listened to it twice. I did not call him back. Some debts, once the interest compounds long enough, simply aren't worth collecting on anymore. And by the time that voicemail landed, I had already gotten everything from Dallas Kepler that I was ever going to need. The $60,000, the finding of no material violation, the federal indictment of the man who'd actually built the scheme he was too foolish to fully understand, and, more than any of that, 22 years worth of proof, finally delivered in the most expensive way imaginable, that I had never once been the redundant one in that building. I deleted the voicemail. I poured myself a glass of iced tea, spiked, as always, a little more generously than strictly necessary, and I went outside to check on my roses which, that particular afternoon, were blooming exactly the deep, defiant red of ink in a well-kept ledger, which felt, all things considered, like exactly the ending I'd earned.